I am an Indian living in colonized India in the 17th century, hypothetically. Why do I have less of a chance of getting shipped to the West as a slave, while my African counterpart is more likely to be shipped as a slave, to be a slave in the Western world? Well, one issue is geography. Let us go to the map. Okay. So here's the map. Okay, we are here in India. If you were to be hypothetically shipped off as a slave to the West, then you would have to be taken from India. And, you know, the Europeans did not have the kind of slavery that the Americans had, right? Slaves were shipped off to the United States mainly. A few to Europe for sure, but not in the numbers that were shipped off to the US. So if you were in India and somebody wanted to ship you off as a slave to the US, you would have to go all the way down south, cross the Cape of Good Hope, then cross the southern Atlantic Ocean, cross the equator, and then go all the way to the North Atlantic Ocean and reach the east coast of the US. That's what you would have to do if you were a slave trader who wanted to ship Indians there. And in those days, mortality rates were very high, and uh, insurance was expensive, and so on. So it did not make economic sense to ship Indians off to the US as slaves. When it comes to West Africa, it was very easy. You just had to cross the North Atlantic. A much shorter and much more direct route to the US compared to bringing somebody from India, right? So it did not make any sense to bring Indians as slaves and ship them to the United States. In West Africa, you already had these slave trading networks that were in place in the between the 15th and 17th centuries. You know, the Europeans, they started trading with at various ports in West Africa, and they created these slave trading networks where local Africans themselves, for monetary benefit, would go and raid African communities deeper in the interior of Africa, and bring back hundreds and thousands of slaves and sell them to the whites, who would then ship them off across the Atlantic and bring them to the US. In the US, they would be used as slaves on sugar and cotton plantations. The mortality rates were very high, and that's why they needed a constant, supply of slaves from West Africa. And that's why it made sense for this to happen from West Africa, not from India. Another thing is that over time, slavery became racialized. Over time, slavery became racialized, and black people became synonymous with slaves in the United States and across the Americas. So if you are black, you were automatically a slave in the Americas. If you were brown, that was confusing because all the natives in the Americas were brown, right? The blacks were slaves. Brown people were not as at the same level as the whites. Obviously, the whites were the superior race, obviously, according to them. That's the racial hierarchy there, the racial caste system the Europeans had constructed. So the Europeans, the white people were at the top. The brown people were undesirable and they were a nuisance because they existed, but they were not slaves. And the black people were the slaves. That was the hierarchy of the Europeans. Even among the whites, you had various, divisions. We'll not go into that right now. So over time, slavery became racialized, and black people were automatically regarded as slaves, and brown people not so much. Now, if you were a British occupier of India, British occupied India, then initially the British were only after plunder. They wanted to trade. Eventually, they expanded in Bengal and other places, and eventually, by the 19th century, they started. By the 18th century, they started taking over a lot of India. And their purpose in India was extraction, and also revenue, land tax, this tax, that tax, zamindar tax, all those taxes, all the revenue, and all the resources that were to be extracted out of India. Monopolization of Indian trade, all of that. And eventually they started ruling India, large parts of India. And they used slavery in India. They used various systems that essentially amounted to slavery in India. They would force people to build highways and roads and bridges for no money, for no labor, for no wages. Um, the Rayatwari system was essentially nothing but slavery. They also sent indentured laborers to various parts of the British Empire, which was once again another word for slavery. But when it comes to eventually the British ruling India, India became the target of missionaries, and the missionaries were vultures who wanted to harvest souls, and they wanted to portray their culture as superior to Indian culture. Now, Indian culture did not have slavery. The Islamic Turkic culture had slavery, but that was not Indian culture, right? Uh, so the British missionaries, they wanted to portray themselves as superior to Hindus. So they could not enslave Indians. I mean, not legally enslave Indians, right? They had all these systems like zamindari, rayatwari, etc., that amounted to slavery, but they could not legally do slavery in India. And eventually, the British sought to portray, to position themselves as the legitimate rulers of India and as a superior culture. And that's why, once again, that they could not impose slavery on India. So even this indentured system, it was like contractual system. You signed a contract, you put your thumbprint, and you were promised wages. Eventually, when you were shipped off, no one knew what happened to you, so did not matter. But that's how it was. So because of these reasons, if you were an Indian person living in British occupied India in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, you had a much less chance of getting shipped off as a slave somewhere, compared to somebody who was living, let's say, in the western part of Africa or other parts of Africa during the time when you had the Ottoman Empire and so on. Yeah, that's why.